I sing the mighty power of God, who made the mountains rise, that spread the flowing seas abroad, and built the lofty skies. Now that's a wonderful hymn speaking to the creative majesty of God, a topic Paul raises in the passage we will be looking at today, so keep an eye and ear out for it. Hello again. Welcome back to my study of the book of Romans. Here is my roadmap showing what section we will be studying today and how it fits into the book as a whole and how we got here. It shows that we are studying the book of Romans and that my videos currently plan on covering the first 6 chapters of the book, at least. Who knows how far I'll get. In the second video, we looked at the introduction section, a sort of a hello from Paul. And in the previous video, prior to this one, we had begun to look at the middle section, which I have entitled Life Without Faith, or the Bad News. In that video, we had looked at Paul's claim that our unrighteousness exposes us to the wrath of God, and we had considered what Paul might mean by the wrath of God. In today's video, we move on to the middle part of the bad news section, which seems to me to outline 5 boasts that we all make as people to shield ourselves from that wrath of God. Today, we will get to the first of those 5 boasts, one that might be worded, God, He is nothing. I don't need God. And if I can scoot the outline to the left to make room, this first boast itself has 3 aspects to it. 1, the infinite God reveals himself to us in his creation. 2, yet we turn from God and invent our own gods. And 3, this puts us on a downward spiral of sin. Now I will begin by reading the entire section that we are covering today, reading from my own NCP or Neil Krauss Paraphrase translation, while showing on the right the outline section that we are at any given time. So, reading Romans 1:19 through 32 in my own paraphrase. God has gone out of his way to make himself known to us. Yes, God is by nature invisible, since concepts like his eternal power and divine nature do not fit readily within the confines of our finite human brains. But we freely see those powers at work in his creation and see his divine nature in what he has made, including ourselves. God liberally sprinkles hints of his glory and existence so that we can see clearly who he is and what he expects of us. We are without excuse if we deny God. The proper response to God's wonderful creation then is to glorify God and to give him thanks. Instead, those who deny God engage in futile, self-serving thinking, and their minds and hearts turn from God and towards an alternative. They transform their God-given brains into gibberish-generating machines and convince themselves that God is some sort of a myth. They exchange the truth about God for a lie, where that lie often takes the form of an image, perhaps a person or a bird or a reptile or some other animal, and then they worship this alternative God, instead giving it glory instead of the glory due God. Yes, they worship a small created thing rather than the wonderful transcendent creator, a creator worthy of all of our praise. May he be blessed forever. Amen. Well, in such cases, God does not intervene, but allows such foolish behavior to proceed to its inevitable unfortunate end, which can take a variety of forms, often, at least it seems to be the case here in Corinth, involving public dishonoring of each other's bodies. For example, again citing local customs here in Corinth, they often join together into groups, and if you can believe it, allow their worship of such gods and beings to devolve into deviant sexual orgies, often involving women with women and men with men, engaging in unspeakable acts. The result is disease, destroyed relationships, harm to the youth, and a huge mess all around. Now, maybe things do not get so extreme as this in Rome, but I am sure that you have people there that, when they deny God, their minds go off the track and they do things almost as bad. Here is a list off the top of my head that I am sure you will agree you see all around you from such people: general unrighteousness, evilness, greed, badness, envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice, gossip, slander, God-haters, violence, pride, boasters, inventors of evil, disobedience to parents, being senseless, unfaithful, unaffectionate, and unmerciful. Wow, what a list. They know that God has decreed that all who do these things are worthy of death, and yet not only do they keep doing these things, they encourage those around them to do them as well. And so ends my reading. And please recall that this is a free paraphrase of my own writing, and I encourage you to go back and read a more conventional translation of these verses as well, for perhaps a more balanced, if harder to read, account. Now, there's a lot of material in these verses, and plenty of questions could be raised and pondered about them. I leave it to you to meditate perhaps on ways that you have denied God and claimed a different, more user-friendly God, and also ways in which the sins and misbehaviors that Paul lists you might be willing to own up to. But I do have two specific questions that I think are important to ask about this passage. The first is that Paul makes an argument that nature, the created world, proves the existence of a righteous and all-powerful God. People like Isaac Newton, William Paley, and others throughout history since then have used a famous watchmaker analogy to extend this argument. However, in modern times, where we have a much greater understanding of science and nature than people in Paul's or even Newton's time had, many, including Richard Dawkins in his book The Blind Watchmaker, argue that God is not at all necessary to explain the world and us. So the question or questions arising here is, 1, do we still believe that nature proves that God exists and that indeed modern science only adds to the wonder and glory of a creative God? 2, are we afraid of science and rational thought, dreading that it may indeed make God obsolete? And 3, in a more general sense, does Paul's argument here still work today? Now, if you wish to get technical, I will agree that nature does not technically prove that God exists. Otherwise, faith would not be required. God did not make it trivial to have faith, but having faith is a darn sight easier having the compelling evidence of nature and of our own existence. But otherwise, of course, I leave it to you to think through these questions. For further reading, I might suggest Paley's essay, The Watch and the Watchmaker, which you can find on the internet, I'm sure. I would even suggest, if you are brave, Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker, written from an atheist perspective, but in my opinion, Dawkins' wonderful descriptions of how things work and the wonders of nature does more to glorify than to disprove God. Dawkins made up his own mind in spite of, not because of, the evidence he presents. And then the second question that might arise has to do with verses 24 through 27 in chapter 1, where Paul levels a strong condemnation of certain homosexual behaviors. Now, in my paraphrase, I have Paul specifically referring to public homosexual behavior performed in the name of worshiping gods. Paul's actual letter, however, is not so specific, and it's ambiguous as to how broad or narrow to understand his condemnation. What do we think is the proper way to understand Paul's words here? And I will list a few options, and you may have your own. One is Paul making a condemnation of public sexual, often homosexual acts performed in the name of worship, sort of the way I worded Paul's words. Or 2, an expression of Paul's personal contempt for any sort of homosexual behavior, which was, of course, a commonly held opinion at the time. Or is Paul stating an expression of God's universal contempt for any sort of homosexual behavior? Or is he making a public safety notice as to the dangers to one's health such behavior risks? Or is it just, as many might state, a statement directed to the time and customs of the direct recipients of the letter, but which has no meaning to our lives today? And again, note that my questions don't have necessarily right or wrong answers. They're meant to get you to think. I think my paraphrase makes clear my view, but I do admit that Paul is not crystal clear here and that other interpretations can be made. So with that, I will sign off for today. Next time we will turn to the second of Paul's 5 boasts or defenses that we put up to protect ourselves from God's wrath, which I phrase as, I am good enough, as good or better than the next guy. So thank you.